Welcome back to This Is Working. I'm Dan Roth, editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. On this show, we talk to leaders who have a significant impact on society and the way we live and work now. Today, my guest is Sally Susman, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pfizer. You won't find many executives better equipped to meet a communications crisis head-on than Sally Susman. Sally is Pfizer's Chief Corporate Affairs Officer. That job sits in the shadows of some of the most publicized campaigns. She has 4 decades of expertise in several industries: cosmetics, financial services, government, and pharmaceuticals. In each industry, she's helped CEOs and politicians navigate social and political issues, rebrandings, and internal and external obstacles. Every crisis is tricky, but nothing compares to her experience at Pfizer. Sally helped reshape the public perception of COVID vaccines and of the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. In her new book, Breaking Through, she shares her life's lessons on being courageously candid, setting intentions, and adapting in any situation. The book is a masterclass in how to communicate, whether internally or externally. Sally, welcome to This Is Working.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Sally, your background was in politics, and in your book, you talk about your family having a very political background. I was wondering, did you ever think that you were going to get into politics, or what was it about politics that made you want to get into communications?
Well, when I was young, like most people, I think when they're young, they want to do good in the world. So I did think about a career in politics. I also thought about a career in journalism, but found my way into my first job in government, where I worked in the mailroom of a Senate office and worked my way up there until I decided to make the shift into the private sector, because I believe big public companies are also great platforms for doing good.
But it's a very different kind of communication, right, between political communication and corporate, or are there similarities between the two?
It's not as different as people think. In fact, this morning I was talking to some government workers and sharing the exact same principles and beliefs that I would say to any person in business. It's really important that your messaging and your messengers are consistent and high quality, regardless of whether it's a political campaign or a big company.
So in your book, you are talking about breakthrough communications and communicators. It feels like there are 2 different kinds of communication. There's the kind that you do outside in the world when you're positioning yourself, when you're talking about your company. And then there's the communication you do internally, how you talk about yourself in meetings or how you give updates. Can you walk through, let's walk through both of those. Mm-hmm. So are there tips or things that you have learned over time? First, just in how you present internally. What have you seen? What do you tell people?
So I thought so much about this, Dan, and as you said, in several different companies and in government, trying to play it out, and wrote 10 principles that I think are really essential. Things like being very intentional. So if you're going to go talk to a colleague, why are you going to go talk to him? Are you just bothering them, or do you have something you want to share? Or being curious is another one. It's important with colleagues internally to ask them questions. How was your weekend? How are the kids? Just being very, very human is really important. And I've laid out these 10 principles, and everyone will sort of cherry pick which ones work best for them. Being humble, being reflective, using humor. And then the toolkit that you use internally shouldn't be all that different from what you do externally. You can't have this sort of one person you are at work and another person when you're out in public. They need to relate to one another. So if your style is to be an educator, then you want to do it in both places. If your style is to ask the right questions, you want to be known for that internally and externally. So it is a little bit different, and of course, much more personal inside companies. But the principles, I think, carry both ways.
So let's say that you are thinking about how you're going to communicate internally. You're saying know what you want to go in. I don't know how you square the circle of knowing what you're going after and also asking these kind of personal questions.
It can be squared. That circle can be squared because you can start out with some ice-breaking, friendly questions, but still know that you're not just there to gossip. You're there to find out, did they approve of how you did something? Do they have a suggestion for how to be helpful? So it sounds contradictory, but I think they can really work well together if you're mindful about how you're doing it.
Let's talk about some of the external communications. You've worked on some of the most difficult, thorny problems the businesses have run into. The biggest one, I mean, this is during when COVID descended on the world. At Pfizer, you were working on the vaccines. You had to figure out how to position the company, how to talk about what was going on, how to bring other companies together. Can you walk through what those early days were like, where the company was focused on the vaccine and you had to focus on how to position Pfizer as you were developing the vaccine?
Well, here I take right from the first principle about being super intentional. I knew early on in March of 2020 that Pfizer was going to try to do something epic and bring forward a scientific transformation of a vaccine in 8 months instead of 12 years. I thought I need to set an equally bold intention for how we will communicate and build trust when people were understandably scared and the technology was new and the timing was fast. And so we did things very differently, far more transparently. So for example, we put our clinical trial protocol, which is usually a top secret document, we put it on the website. I embedded reporters from the Wall Street Journal and a documentary film crew from Nat Geo with us on the journey. And believe me, Dan, I had many sleepless nights when I thought, I am filming the greatest goof up, the biggest failure in corporate history if our vaccine doesn't work. I also realized that if our vaccine didn't work, we'd have much bigger problems as a society than a bad news day for Pfizer. And taking those bold risks, I believe, was essential to moving Pfizer from a company with a reputation that was a bit of a laggard across all big pharma to now a top 10 global brand for the last 2 years, according to the Fortune's most admired companies. So being super intentional about this trust transformation that needed to happen alongside the scientific transformation.
You had been at Pfizer for years at that point. So were these ideas that you had in your back pocket anyways? Did you want to bring a journal reporter in and embed them inside? Did you want to have a documentary crew? Or did those come in the moment?
Well, you're right. I've been at Pfizer for 15 years. And I went there specifically to work on this reputation problem because I'd worked at 2 terrific companies, Estee Lauder and American Express, both of whom have great reputations. And I thought, it's crazy. These people make life-saving medicine and they have a not good reputation. And during those first 10 years, I struggled. I sat in focus groups where I heard terrible things about the industry. And I tried and had at best only slight or incremental progress, nothing really breakthrough. And then, and to be fully candid, I was almost thinking, maybe I can't do it. Maybe it won't happen. But then when the pandemic hit, I saw an opportunity that I felt I had trained my whole life to do. And I'm so grateful that I was there then and had the opportunity to be helpful. A good friend of mine says, the only thing harder than being at the center of a crisis is being on the sidelines of a crisis. And being in the center of that crisis gave me and Pfizer and our team a chance to really blossom and show the world who we are and to put our best selves forward and to be present and make the case. And we did.
But why couldn't you have done those kind of breakthrough communications before? Was it an internal issue? Was it too hard to motivate people around you that there had to be this change in how you position Pfizer? Was it that the market didn't care? No one wanted to hear what Pfizer was doing internally? I mean, what or was it the crisis that made all of this happen?
Well, you won't be surprised that my answer is going to be about leadership. And you know very well Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. You've spoken with him, and he's a game changer. And when he said, we're going to do this vaccine, we're going to make the impossible possible, and he had to assign a project manager for this. And he did something that I've never seen a CEO do. He assigned himself the project manager. And that set wheels in motion that we would be doing things very differently. And that, yes, of course, the pandemic was meaningful, but my argument is it's our response to the pandemic that separated us. And Albert really drove that response And being in the small team of people that talk to him on a regular basis, it was very inspiring to me, and it made me feel the courage to do it.
We had Albert on the show. It's a great episode where he talks about being the project manager and making those decisions and having the Zoom room where he's got just tons of faces and having to call on people he's never called on
Right.
before, and moving at the speed that Pfizer had never moved. It was a fascinating look inside a company that has to move at twice as fast as, maybe 10 times faster than it's moved before. And Sally, when you were deciding to be more transparent, and you talk about the Nat Geo documentary, which is a really fascinating look at how the vaccine was developed, and the day when you guys all found out that the vaccine had been accepted. I mean, it's really incredible filming. But can you talk about those times where you were thinking, why did I bring this crew in? What have I done?
Oh, yes, I can. I thought about it many times. Think about this. We're on this major quest. We're working in a hybrid fashion. We're trying to keep our manufacturing plants aseptic clean level. We've got our scientists in the lab, and I'm schlepping this film crew through and thinking, what if they interrupt important progress? We had to be so careful, and I even felt bad to be taking the time from the scientists who were so busy working on this in the vaccine labs. But I also thought, Dan, that in a job as a chief communicator, you are also the chief documentarian of your company. And I knew for those 85,000 employees, if we got this right, it would be a story that we want to tell to our children and grandchildren and to the world for the rest of our lives. So I felt the risk was worth it. On the day that you're recalling, it was a Sunday, and we were gathered around a conference room in Connecticut, waiting to hear the outcome, and the cameras are filming us. It was a scary moment for me, but the end result is something that we're so proud of, that I encourage people to really take the risk to open the kimono a bit and let journalists come in. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reporters were with us, and we found out the news on Sunday. We announced it on Monday morning, and the Journal ran 4 pages. They had the whole story, and their headline was Pfizer's vaccine, crazy deadlines, and a pushy CEO. And, it's a headline that makes me laugh too, and yet they nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
It was the audacity of the goal and the drive of the CEO that made all the difference, and they could tell the story because they'd been allowed to live the story.
I want to shout out some people who are on the live stream here. April says, good morning from Houston. We also have in the stream Kasia from Brazil. Sue says, hello. Ben says he finds this conversation inspiring. Christine says she loves the idea of intentional and transparent communication. So speaking of that, there is one thing to be transparent, and then you can also often have a CEO or executives who want to be shown in the best light, but maybe don't love when that light is not so positive. So you talk about Albert showing up as the pushy CEO. I can imagine there's some CEOs that would say, pushy is not who I am. Sally, you and your team need to go change that. How do you, as a communicator, as a chief communicator, deal with the question of executives saying, I want the right story told. I don't want any story told. You can be transparent, but how do you guarantee me that it's going to put our company in the best light? I mean, how do you deal with that?
That is always a tough moment when news comes out that's less than flattering or even critical. And it's very important to build those relationships internally that you were asking me about earlier, and bring people along on the journey of this interview or this opportunity so that the risks are understood. I mean, every time you step out in public, if you're a visible public figure, you have a risk. And educating people to the pros and cons of this kind of engagement and the rough and tumble of journalists means they're a little bit more prepared. Maybe their trust in you is greater because you've helped them to parse the risks and to understand why we're taking this risk. What is it we need to get across? And to hopefully work for leaders who have the self-confidence to not be insecure and take this stuff too seriously. At Pfizer, we like to say that we take our jobs seriously, but not ourselves. And that's really crucial.
So for other people who are climbing the ladder as communications executives, would you say to them, take the risks, be prepared, bring people along in the journey, but make sure that you're taking the risks. And if the risks don't work out, then you just have to deal with that. I mean,
Yes,
yeah.
I definitely would say that. I mean, you can really die in the still waters of your fear if you just don't engage. Um, you know, I know you were a journalist with whom I engaged and gave broad access to the Lauder family, and it was scary to me. But you wrote a better story because you knew, had deep interviews, and trusting trusting your own skills, trusting your leaders. I mean, if you have a leader that you feel you can't put in front of a journalist, then you have a bigger problem than a press problem. You have a management and a leadership problem.
Yeah, and I think that if I could just speak to that story. So this was when I was at Fortune, was doing a story about the Estee Lauder, the Lauder family. And I think that I also felt like we had developed a relationship. I owed it to you. You had given me so much access. I owed it to you to make sure I did a fair story. I knew that if I did something that didn't turn out right, that I have to go in front of you and be like, and you would say to me, this wasn't fair. And I would feel really bad. So there was also a relationship that was built that as a journalist, I felt like I had to honor.
And I think communicators in general need to want to know journalists. Some of them fear journalists, or they only want to come in the cold pitch. And it's so important. I learned so much from talking to journalists. They sometimes know better than people in the companies what's going on. So developing those relationships is really important.
I want to talk a little bit about this question of how you pick the topics to weigh in on. Because this one thing, you don't believe in just transparency and weighing in on everything. You think that a company has to know what are the topics that it needs to own or be ready to talk about. And it can't just be the corporate topics. You have to weigh in on
Right.
society, right?
Right.
So how do you decide that?
Well, I thought a lot about this, and when these questions were coming faster and more furiously in recent years, I developed a 5-question framework, and the framework is in the book. But just very quickly, the first question is, how does it relate to our purpose? So Pfizer's purpose is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. There are many important issues like deforestation in the Amazon. It's an important issue, but it's not related to our purpose. And if you speak out on everything, you lose your agency. Our second question is, how does it impact our stakeholders? And there's no more important stakeholder than our colleagues. And so how will colleagues and other important stakeholders feel about this? The third question is, how does it relate to our values? Not our politics, but our values, because companies shouldn't be political, but they should have values. We have 4: courage, excellence, equity, and joy. The fourth question is, what are my choices in how I respond? Because sometimes it's a reporter on deadline who says, I've been working on this story for 10 months and you have 15 minutes to respond, or somebody pushing a petition in your face. I say, take the power back, take the pen back. If you have something to say, you can say it in your own way. Often a letter to employees is a great way, and then you post it on your website. So feel your control. And then the fifth and final question I always ask is, what is the cost of our silence? So sometimes here, like on an issue of racial equality or an issue against violence, it's just silence is unacceptable. So that's my framework, but I have shared it on LinkedIn, and I welcome with my followers the engagement about, do they agree? Do they disagree? Do they have different questions? Because this is an ongoing and evolving kind of metric for people like me.
Well, I think that for executives, for anyone running any kind of company, it must be hard to decide when, even with this kind of a framework, when you're going to weigh in, and you watch what happens if you get it wrong. I'm watching this week, Bud Light dealing with this question. They're getting hammered over trans rights and are they supporting it? But they haven't talked at all. They haven't posted anywhere since the end of March. I don't know what is like. When do you decide? Do you defend yourself? Do you speak up? Do you ask other people at other companies to come in and defend you? I mean, what do you do in a case like this where you maybe have weighed in on something and the crowd or some crowd has turned against you? How do you decide when to defend yourself or how to defend yourself?
It's a great question. And I always think first and foremost, we should have the ability and the courage to speak for ourselves, as opposed to trying to get this one or that one to say something nice on our behalf. I think companies, CEOs, leaders should really speak for themselves. And if your decision is grounded in again, in your values, you then stick to it. I think that's really important.
Mm.
You know, for example, the question about whether or not to pull out of Russia. Pfizer has an exemption because medicine companies have a humanitarian exemption. A kid with cancer in Russia is a kid with cancer and needs his and deserves his medicine as much as anyone. So we decided, after much discussion, not to pull out of Russia. But it didn't feel right to just have a business as usual approach or to appear to be profiting during this period of aggression. And so we also said we will donate every penny we make to the Ukrainian relief effort. And we have done that nonstop for over a year now. And did everyone agree with that? No. Did some people push back? Yes. But I don't think you should change your position. And in fact, sometimes it's the changing that causes even greater controversy and consternation. So think hard, pause, think hard, work from values, and then stick to your guns.
And you talk about this idea of the executive pen is often the most valuable weapon that you've got. Maybe weapon is the wrong term, but it is such a powerful voice. That's a change in communication. I mean, it used to be that you would put out press releases or the company would speak with one voice, but you're talking about the idea of executives kind of speaking in their own voice, right? Maybe not filtered through communication or not maybe fully vetted by a committee. How do you decide when a scientist should write her own piece or the executive should leave a comment on someone's post? I mean, doesn't that get you into dangerous waters? How do you decide when people should be talking in their own voice?
It's a great question. And we've worked hard to educate internally as to what are appropriate kinds of comments. When is it right to speak out? You can't operate in a large company like the police. You know, I can't stay up all night trolling to see who said what. I have faith in my colleagues. We, in my team, have been instructors in how to be successful at this. But allowing a degrees of freedom has humanized the company. And for me, my scientists are the greatest treasure. I love when the scientists are out talking. It shows people we're a science company and we believe in these people. And I learned a lot through the pandemic about the power of having the scientific leaders speaking. So educate and trust.
Mm-hmm. Haley says, as a previous crisis communications professional, I would love to hear some of Sally's tips for staying calm and navigating a crisis.
I believe that staying calm is essential for anyone who works in crisis communications. It's why I have a whole chapter written about pausing and preparing. Because if we're going through any kind of a tough circumstance and I sound anxious or I sound hysterical, it's only going to make things 10 times worse. And the communicators that get brought into the C-suite, that get invited to address the board, are ones that can exude a sense of personal calm, that you know you're working from principles that are tried and trusted, that you're a good listener, and so you don't just come in, you know, hot, but listen carefully. This is something that I've worked hard to develop as a professional presence over time. And I feel this is an insightful question because that chief communicator in the heart of a crisis needs to be able to establish the control room, bring all the parties together, and being able to exude a professional sense of calm is hugely important.
And one of the things you talk about in the book also is this need to ask questions and to start understanding everything so you can map out exactly what happened. You want to get all the answers first. Is that the role of the crisis communicator to do that?
It is, and it's a funny story because this goes back to my early days in communications at American Express when, you know, we had a small crisis and my boss, great guy, Mike O'Neill, sat down and started just asking all these questions. And I thought, when is this guy going to give us the instructions? Why are we just sitting here asking all these questions? And I came to learn over time that these questions are the important first step. And I try to list in the book some of the good questions to ask, always starting with, was anybody hurt? Are people at risk? Etc. And that these questions give you the necessary fodder to make a good statement. And it's often the case that you make a statement that's partial with saying things like, we're reporting to you what we know now. We will come back in 2 hours or 6 hours, and maintaining a dialogue with the public that shows you are on it, you are concerned, you are not going on vacation, you are not going home. The lights are always on in this command center until we solve the problem.
Great. All right, I'm going to end with a couple quotes here from, I have one more question, but some more quotes from folks watching. Sherry says, I've worked in healthcare my entire career. I learned that being a leader is where you quickly pivot, take on responsibility, and uplift your team. Communicating that is fantastic. And Sherry says, this is exactly what crisis management is about. Her job was to document what the team is doing. Communication is about letting the world see what was really happening. Sally, you have worked for 9 CEOs, 6 directly. You manage large teams. I'm curious if there's anything that you, as you think about yourself as a manager, are there certain ways that you like to manage? Are there things you've learned from others, things you've learned yourself? What are some of your best management tips?
Well, 2 things come to mind, Dan. The first one is that you work for the company. The CEO may be your boss, and you certainly take his or her instruction and debate it or discuss it and make a plan. But the ability to work for 3 companies over 9 CEOs, I think is because I really learned that I needed to take an enterprise view. And sometimes those issues are bigger than any given individual in a company. And really understanding that you are working for the company, I think is very important. The second thing is, in our field, in my field, there is no singular degree. It's not like you're a lawyer and you get a law degree, or you're a doctor and you get an MD. What I do is learned by time in the role. And so I'm now at a point in my career where I really want to apprentice others and show them how you do these things. It's why I like being back in the office, frankly, as opposed to working remotely. And it's why I wrote the book.
Great. Sally Susman, thank you for joining us here today. This was terrific.
Thank you, Dan.
We've released each episode of This Is Working as a podcast. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, and you can get more advice from the world's top leaders by subscribing to my newsletter using the link you see on the screen right there. I'm Dan Roth. Thanks for watching This Is Working.